Luther, stay here and protect the cabin. I'm going after him.
Samuel stared at his father, his eyes wide. The boy was very pale, but he seemed unafraid. Only then did O'Brien see the scarlet splash of blood on his son's left arm.
Are you wounded, Samuel?
He got grazed by a ball, Colonel. Come clean through the door. One of them Indians using a Sharp's Big 50, I reckon.
O'Brien stepped to the door, but then he looked back.
Samuel, are you sure you're all right?
I'm fine, Pa.
Luther?
I know what to do, Colonel.
There was nothing more to be said. O'Brien slid back the door's wooden bolt and charged into the tumbling snow and the wild wolf wind. O'Brien, his rifle up and ready, moved to the corner of the cabin in a crouching walk. His eyes searched into the snowstorm, but his visibility was only limited to a few yards around him. He saw no Apaches. Walking carefully, his eyes never at rest, he stepped toward the corral. A ball kicked up dirt and snow at his feet. He swung the rifle to his right, seeking a target. The snow-blurred shape of an Apache was knocked 20 feet away. The Indian frantically rammed a fresh ball into the barrel of an old muzzle loader, his eyes on the white man. O'Brien shouldered his Henry. Snow and ice stung his eyes, and he knew his aim would be an uncertain thing. But before he could take a shot, he heard the report of Ironside's rifle. The Apache took the hit square in his chest. O'Brien stayed where he was and got down on one knee, his gaze reaching out to the corral. One of the draft horses trotted to the rail opposite the lean-to. The animal lifted its head, then looked behind it, as though troubled by something or someone. Despite the cold, O'Brien's right hand sweated on the Henry stock, and his heart hammered in his ears. He recognized the symptoms of fear. He felt them many times during his 4 years of war. He knew the kind of men he was about to face. Resolute, ruthless, and relentless. Superb guerrilla fighters. These Apaches wanted him dead. They'd never leave until they had his scalp and his horses. O'Brien moved again. Reaching the corner post of the corral, he took a knee again. Toward the lean-to, his big sorrel seemed alarmed by a man smell he'd never encountered before. Planning his every movement, O'Brien rose carefully to his feet. The snow no longer relented, but came down thicker and faster, tossed this way and that by the gleeful wind. He shivered, suddenly very cold. He bent to slip under the top rail of the corral. Down! An arrow stuck into the fence post where his head had just been a moment earlier. He completed his duck into the corral and then straightened. His eyes barely had time to register a charging Apache before the man was almost on top of him. The Indian had tossed away his bow, but now he held a war lance high, ready for a killing downward thrust. The steel head was 2.5 feet long, made from the blade of a Mexican cavalry saber, rawhided to a painted and feathered shaft. Separated as they were by the poles of the corral, the Indian didn't stab the lance at the white man. He drew back his arm and threw it. Shamus twisted away at the last moment, but the hurtling lance still found him. The blade entered his back low, an inch or two from his spine, the honed saber biting deep. As he staggered a step or two, trying to bring his Henry to bear, all the weight of the bobbin lance shaft stressed its carbon steel blade. The Apache had ground the thick back of the saber to give it an edge, and the blade was thin. It snapped somewhere in O'Brien's back, and the shaft dropped to the ground. Waves of agony slamming at him, O'Brien knew he was weakening fast. The horses were more nervous, meaning there had to be another Apache somewhere behind him in the corral, hidden behind the swirling snow. He figured he could count the remainder of his life in seconds. The Indian who had hit him with the lance made no attempt to climb into the corral. He drew a Johnstone .44 from a rawhide holster on his hip and shoved the big revolver out in front of him at eye level. Crazed with pain, O'Brien fired from the hip. The Apache, hit hard, rode into eternity. An arrow shot past O'Brien's left ear. He turned and searched for a target. He saw the Apache almost instantly, a stocky warrior wearing a Union Army greatcoat with a corporal chevrons on the sleeves. O'Brien pumped 3 bullets into the Indian. Beside himself with rage, O'Brien's vision narrowed to a black tunnel, shot through with searing streaks of flaming scarlet. He staggered to the dead Apache.
You bastard! You tried to kill me on the day my son is born?
O'Brien's boot smashed again and again into the Apache's bloody face.
Colonel!
The voice came from behind him. He turned, his face still twisted and ugly by a mindless rage. Ironside stood in front of him.
It's over, Colonel. The Apaches are dead or gone.
But O'Brien didn't see Ironside. He saw an Apache warrior with a rifle in his hands coming at him. He took a step back, clawing for his colt.
Pa!
Samuel ran to his father and threw his arms around his waist.
It's me! It's Samuel! That's Luther!
O'Brien looked like a man waking from a dream. He blinked, and then he looked down at the boy.
Samuel?
Please come home now, Pa! Ma needs you!
The snow did a dervish dance around father and son, and the cold air smelled like raw iron.
Sarah.
Samuel dropped his arms from his father's waist. Then he stared at his own hands, which were glistening, stained red with blood.
Luther?
He held them up for the man to see. Ironside stepped to O'Brien and placed his strong right arm around him.
Time to go home, Colonel.
But Shamus O'Brien didn't hear. His eyes closed as he descended into darkness.
Colonel!
Ironside caught him on the way down. Samuel walked a few steps behind as Ironside carried his father into the cabin. He didn't take his eyes off his bloody hands, a sight he'd remember for the rest of his days.